It's with my great pleasure that I'm able to bring you my grandfather's story, who died 10 years ago, and what it was like to grow up in Poland before the war, during World War II, and what happened after. I will, on very rare occasions, intersperse my grandfather's voice just so that you can hear what he sounded like and know that this is his story. And I hope that you gain some knowledge about the history of that time and what it was like to live during these trying times of yesteryear.
I'll start at the very beginning of my life. I was born in March 1917, just 1 year before the end of World War I.
In a Polish town, Radom, close to Warsaw, about 60 miles from Warsaw.
My parents told me I arrived 5 years after they were married. Since I was their first child, they treated me as someone rather special. They tried to do everything they could to help me develop as a young boy. My mother always said I was a little too fragile to go to school, so I had to learn at home. And I actually started learning quite early. When I was born, Poland was no longer occupied by the Russians, but by the Germans. The war had pushed the Russians out of this part of the world. Importantly, the Germans at that time behaved very differently from the way they acted later during World War II. So, occupation under the Germans felt quite different for people compared with Russian rule. Still, everyday life in Radom wasn't affected very much. We lived in a quite large apartment that had a very big kitchen with an enormous oven.
And in the kitchen had a very large oven where we could not only cook up everything.
Ovens like that were very common in that part of the world back then. Our home was in a rented building, and we lived on the second floor. What I remember from when I was probably around 8 or 10 years old is that my mother's parents, my grandparents, came to live with us in the same apartment. My grandfather loved to travel. He would often leave his business running on its own without even insuring it. During one of those trips, a fire broke out and destroyed everything. He lost it all and had to come live with us. By then, he was already quite weak and not very healthy. I remember him lying in bed most of the time, but every morning, without fail, he needed his glass of vodka. And when I was 8 or 10, he would always ask me to join him. He'd have me bring a small glass of vodka so we could drink it together in the morning. That's how I got used to the taste of vodka, though I never became an alcoholic. As I said, my father was a very gentle man. He never admonished his children harshly. Normally, he only expressed his displeasure when something was clearly wrong. He was also very charitable, but he believed charity should involve direct contact with people. From time to time, he would bring a completely strange person, someone he regarded as poor and not doing well, home for dinner with his own family. These people were sometimes his own age or older. The next thing I remember from my childhood is going with my mother to Warsaw by train for the first time. We went to visit our uncle, my mother's younger brother. She always tried to take care of him, even though he didn't really need any care. He was working, I don't remember in what capacity, for another uncle who owned a mill. That other uncle was a very rich man with many enterprises. I didn't visit him very much, but I did meet his wife, who was my father's sister. They had a separate house in the center of Warsaw, decorated in many different styles, with very different rooms. However, I decided never to go back there again because I didn't like the way my aunt treated my mother. I don't know exactly what happened to that whole family during the war. From time to time, I also stayed with another aunt and her family, especially during the summer. We would go outside Warsaw for vacation together with her 2 daughters. This was a bit later, when I was probably around 12. I visited them very often. They were pleasant people. At least one of the daughters was older than me, and she introduced me to various leftist organizations and leftist groups that were vacationing in the same place. Since my mother had decided I could not go to public school and had to learn at home, I also loved to read. Maybe that was partly because I had to prepare for high school. I started reading many books from the city library. I was probably the youngest person there who came for books. Of course, at first I wasn't very discriminating, so I read both fiction and scientific books. I soon began making notes from the scientific ones. Among the fiction books I read, and greatly appreciated at that time, were the works of Tagore, the Indian Hindu writer. I also read books that I thought at the time were written by an American. They were about the Indians in America. Later I learned the author was actually German. His name was Karl May. I started reading books that were really too difficult for my age, but I developed a taste for them that grew much stronger later. Finally, the day came when I had to go to high school. My mother arranged for me to be accepted on a scholarship. I entered the entrance class, which was essentially a repetition of the 7th year of public school. If I hadn't passed it, I would not have been accepted for further studies because the high school was very selective. But of course, I made it through the entrance class and continued. The first high school I attended was called a vocational gymnasium. It was coeducational. Both girls and boys were accepted. I think it was the only coeducational high school in the city. The other high schools were either for boys only or for girls only. We had very good teachers from the beginning. In the entrance class in the first year, the class supervisor was a lady who taught natural sciences. She was very good, very pleasant, and took excellent care of us. She helped us understand life in general, as well as the biological side of plants and animals. However, after 2 years, her husband received a governmental appointment in Warsaw, and she left with him. I don't know what happened to her or her family later. Other excellent teachers included the Polish language teacher, the German teacher, the history teacher, the mathematics teacher, the physics teacher, and the Latin teacher. As a curiosity, the Latin teacher was also the sheriff of the city police at the same time. That actually helped me later when I got involved in some student unrest in the 1930s, probably between 1932 and 1934, since I finished high school in 1935. The daily contact and exchange between boys and girls at school helped us develop and prepared us well for later life. Many students who finished high school went abroad to continue their studies. Time passed, and I was getting older. After 2 years in high school, starting from the 3rd year, I had to pay for my studies myself. So I earned the money by tutoring other students at my school and some younger children outside school. This was during the recession that began in 1929, which made life quite difficult for our large family. As I mentioned, there were 5 of us siblings. My sister also tried to help by working in a store that was partly related to our family. She continued working until the war started and probably even into the 1st year of the war. At the same time, I became involved in some social movements that were anti-fascist. I started reading more books on social matters, as well as scientific books related to the biology of plants, animals, and human beings. Among them were Karl Marx's Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. I also read some psychology books, including Freud. I read books on the history of mankind, philosophy, and artists, among others, about Spinoza and his theory of pantheism. As I understood it, he believed that God is in every animal and every plant in the world, and that we should regard all creatures as good and treat them humanely. I was also deeply involved in a leftist organization that had a large library. Even before I entered high school, I became the head of that library, which allowed me to read even more. In addition to fiction by Thomas Mann, Heine, Sinclair Lewis, and others, I also read Kipling and many more authors whose names I can no longer remember. On the other side, I also read Mein Kampf at that time and was appalled by the ideas of the Nazi movement, ideas that later led to World War II and the destruction of so many human beings, especially Jews, but also people of other nations. I may return to that subject later because it affected me quite strongly. We developed very good, equal relationships with the other students, both boys and girls. As I said, I met many of them again after the war, and they had very different fates. Before continuing my narrative, I would like to say a few words about my mother. My mother was a small person, strong-willed, and a very good cook. She loved her family and did everything she could to help us all, especially when times became quite dire during the recession. As children, we probably did not fully understand the sacrifices she made for us and for the rest of the family. Her brother, whom she loved and wanted to help, the one I already mentioned, did not always make it the right thing to do. My mother was a very wise person. Many girls and ladies from the large family, as well as people outside the family, would come to talk with her and ask for her advice. I loved my mother very much, and I greatly admired everything she did for us. Now I am a bit confused about the timing after high school. I always thought that the big snowstorm happened in the winter between 1929 and 1930, and that I then started the entrance class of high school. But in that case, I would have spent 6 years in high school. I know very well that I finished in May 1935, and that high school, including the entrance class, took only 5 years. Still, this does not change the facts themselves. My high school was probably one of the best in the country. It was also the only co-educational high school in Poland at that time, at least as far as I knew. All high schools became co-educational only after the war, not before. All those years of study felt as if we grew up together. We all came to high school as very young children. There were even 2 students in our class who were younger than I was. When we finished, they needed special permission from the Minister of Education to receive their certificate of maturity because of their age. Going to school together with girls helped us overcome any prejudices. In the later years, we no longer thought much about it. We regarded most of them simply as colleagues and friends, and we visited one another's families without any other thoughts. Of course, not every student was a very good student. Abilities varied from person to person, but almost everyone managed. Sometimes when I hear Americans complaining that their children have too much schoolwork and no time for anything else, I cannot understand it. Kids always find time to play and do other things. But if they do not do their daily work, sometimes even more than daily work, and then complain that they are overworked, it is not a good sign for the educational level after they finish high school. It is true that at that time there was no television and no internet. We could devote our free time to whatever we wanted. Many of us used that time for additional reading, not only what the school required, but often beyond it. In that way, we gained a much wider knowledge of the world and of current events. Our interest in political and social matters was much higher than what I see today among young people. I would say that the 5 years I spent in high school were quite uneventful, if one thinks only about education. I had no great trouble learning, and from beginning to end I was one of the better students. There was only one student who was at the same level or slightly better. During high school, we also became involved with various ideas. Some came from observing what was happening around us, and some came from the literature we read. We read a great deal, both books assigned by our teachers and others. We had to write essays about them. Sometimes it was even difficult for me, and I needed a little help from older students in the family when writing essays on Polish literature. I had no problems with other languages, mathematics, physics, chemistry, or natural sciences. As I said before, my mother arranged for me to be accepted. At the beginning, I received a scholarship, so for the first 2 or 3 years, I did not have to pay any tuition. The tuition itself was not too large, 30 zlotys a month, which at the exchange rate of that time came to $6 a month. When I had to start paying, I did not want to burden my parents. So with time, I developed quite a large number of tutoring positions. The money from tutoring was enough to cover the tuition and other expenses. I will continue the story leading up to World War II in the next video in the series.